Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Bipartisan Policy Center for this webinar on ending veterans' homelessness. I am Dennis Shea, the Executive Director of the recently launched J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. The center is focused on realizing a decent, safe, and affordable home for every American family. As we approach Veterans Day, we wanted to shine a spotlight on a particularly important issue: homelessness among those men and women who have served our country and our nation's armed forces. On any given night, nearly 40,000 veterans experience homelessness. And I think we can all agree that this situation is simply unacceptable. We are thrilled to be joined today by Congressman Mike Levin, who is in his second term representing California's 49th Congressional District, covering northern San Diego and southern Orange County. Representative Levin leads the Veterans House Affairs Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity, which covers important issues for veterans in their housing, their employment, and their educational opportunities. He is a strong advocate for service members and veterans with an impressive record working to strengthen and expand veterans' benefits during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. So thank you for joining us, Congressman Levin, and we look forward to hearing a few thoughts from you before we hit you up with some questions. So Congressman Levin.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis, for having me. Thank you for that kind introduction and for hosting this important discussion. I'm incredibly grateful for all the work of the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy, and all you do for housing to expand quality, safe, affordable housing for all Americans, certainly including our veterans. And as you said, as Vice Chair of the House Veterans Affairs Committee and Chair of the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity, a top priority of mine, and I think of everybody on that committee, Republican or Democrat, is ensuring that everybody who served our country in the military has access to quality and affordable housing. Simple as that. And I think that we also all agree that as a nation, we have a responsibility to ensure that if you serve in the military, that you do not go hungry, that you do not go homeless, and that you do not go jobless if you want to find work. And unfortunately, we haven't always lived up to these responsibilities. As we know, we continue to have unacceptable numbers of veterans living on the street or struggling to get their footing in civilian life. I am absolutely committed to changing that. And I'm really grateful to have you all as partners in this important work. And while we have a lot of work to do, I'm really proud of the progress that we're making. And in the last couple of years, we've done a lot in Congress on a bipartisan basis to address veteran homelessness and to improve economic opportunities for our veterans. And it's been a pleasure. I've been serving now just about 3 years, but we've introduced dozens of bipartisan bills and amendments to support our veterans, and now 16 bipartisan bills that have been signed into law by 2 administrations. So I'm really proud of that. I think our subcommittee is probably one of the most productive in the Congress on a bipartisan basis in terms of what we actually get through and get done. The legislation that we've passed has really hit the range of issues that you talked about when you referenced the jurisdiction of our subcommittee. Everything from enhancing veterans' quality of life by prioritizing economic programs at VA, expanding access to STEM programs for student veterans, improving TAP, the Transition Assistance Program for our service members that are returning to civilian life, and quite a lot more. And one of the bills that I am particularly proud of is the Johnny Isaacson and David Rowe Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Act, which was signed into law at the very beginning of that year. That truly landmark legislation was the product of years of bipartisan work and the strong leadership of our chairman for the full HVAC, full House Veterans Affairs Committee, Mark Takano, and the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee ranking member, John Tester, as well as their Republican counterparts after whom the bill was named. It includes numerous legislative initiatives from literally dozens of House Democrats and provisions from nearly 60 House passed bills. And I'll speak about a few of them that I was particularly pleased to see in the package because we helped write them. One is the Homeless Veteran Coronavirus Response Act to address veteran homelessness during the pandemic by allowing VA to use existing homelessness funds for a wider range of services such as food, clothing, blankets, hygiene items, transportation, telecommunications, equipment, and services. Also authorizing VA to collaborate with outside organizations to facilitate shelters on its properties, loosening restrictions on the amount and the use of rent and per diem payments, and requiring VA to ensure veterans participating in VA homeless programs have had access to telehealth, so critically important during the pandemic. Another piece of the Isaacson Rowe package was the Legal Services for Homeless Veterans Act, the Housing for Women Veterans Act, and the Reducing Veteran Homelessness Act, which, when combined, address veteran homelessness by number one, directing VA to award grants to entities that provide legal services to homeless and at-risk veterans. Two, directing VA to complete a gap analysis of its programs that provide assistance to homeless women veterans. And we've seen this now for the past number of years where the rate of veteran homelessness pre-pandemic has been declining, but the rate of women veterans who are homeless, that has been increasing dramatically. And that's a very disturbing trend that we need to address. Increasing the per diem payments under the grant and per diem program and reimbursing the grant and per diem recipients for fees to access local homeless management information systems so they can better track outcomes of homeless veterans, and utilizing contracts to fill gaps in HUD-VASH case management. So incredibly important as well. It's also critical to me that when we pass legislation, our work doesn't stop there. We have to make sure that it is being implemented properly, and our team is closely monitoring the VA's implementation of this legislation to ensure these policies are actually being executed on effectively and in a timely way. I will also mention that our subcommittee is doing a lot on existing programs for our homeless veterans and trying to establish new resources where we can, where gaps exist. We, I think, collectively agree with President Lincoln's promise to care for those who shall have borne the battle, for their families, for their caregivers, for their survivors. We owe a debt of gratitude, obviously, to our veterans that we can never fully repay. But the ongoing bipartisan progress, I think, is the best way we help fulfill President Lincoln's promise. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about our work. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Levin, for those remarks. Very much appreciated, and very much appreciate your bipartisanship. It's very important. You mentioned that the rate of homelessness among vets prior to COVID-19 had declined significantly. I've seen 50% decline. So there's a tremendous amount of success. But then the COVID-19 pandemic hit. From your perspective, how has the pandemic impacted homelessness among veterans specifically? And could you describe a little bit more detail about the legislation you mentioned that was passed in response to the pandemic, specifically for veterans and veterans experiencing homelessness?
Well, Dennis, it's been tough. It's been tough. I think, like many Americans, service members, veterans, they've experienced serious financial strain as a result of the pandemic. I remember going with my wife to a Memorial Day event just a couple months in, where food banks in my district were offering meals for service members and their families experiencing food insecurity. And my wife and I were about a mile away. We saw the line of cars, and we thought, "What is going on here? Is there some other event that we're not aware of? Is it a ball game, a concert? What's going on? Can't be, right? It's COVID." So what is it? It was a line for food. And as I was speaking that day to service members and their families, I think it was really moving to me that a lot of them had never had to go to a food bank before. Many of them had told me that they'd volunteered at food banks and other community organizations. And it really just opened my eyes that you had families, young children, in many cases, who had served the country and who didn't have enough to eat and didn't have enough money to cover expenses. So I think what we tried to do throughout the pandemic was to deliver meaningful relief, whether through the CARES Act or through the American Rescue Plan. And I'm really glad that we were able to do a lot of historic things that hopefully met the challenge that we faced at the time. Obviously, we know, and this is broader than just the context for veterans, but really historic rent relief, mortgage relief, doing all we could to prevent evictions. And I think it made a huge difference. I know it made a huge difference in our community because we would get tons of calls and contacts in our office from veterans and service members in our community, in our district, trying to make ends meet, who worked with us to ensure that they could stay afloat. And specifically on the issue of homelessness, we, as I mentioned, we passed the Homeless Veteran Coronavirus Response Act, and what that did was allow VA to use existing homelessness funds for a wider range of services and really to be responsive to the conditions that they saw on the ground, and to collaborate with outside organizations in a way that they previously could not, to house veterans and to offer services. A lot of people that needed the help in the veteran community were people who were ineligible for certain programs and services because of their discharge status. We wanted to make sure that we helped them as well. So I'm very proud of some of the things that we did with regard, for example, to the HUD-VASH program, where now, other than honorable discharges, can also receive a HUD-VASH voucher if they're in need of housing.
Mhm. Well, thank you. It sounds like the resources that were allocated for vets and to mitigate and prevent homelessness actually reach them. But we've had some experience over the past year with the rental assistance program, where $46 billion plus was allocated for rental assistance, but there were some bottlenecks in the process to get that relief to households, mostly at the local and state level. Congress appropriated the money. So are you, from your vantage point, are you confident that the resources that have been allocated for vets are getting to them during this difficult period?
Well, we don't have all the data yet, but what we've been able to gather so far is promising. One program that has been incredibly successful is SSVF, the Supportive Services for Veteran Families program. And that was one of the first federal initiatives to really help reduce the risks faced by homeless veterans during the pandemic. And what we know, and it's pretty recent data, between March 2020 and July 2021, there were almost 30,000 veteran households, 29,231 veteran households that have been placed in hotels or motels. And of those, 17,623 have been placed in permanent housing. So those are encouraging numbers, but I also am very mindful that we cannot be complacent. We continue to receive briefings from VA and hold hearings on the VA committee monitoring the implementation of this assistance. And of course, we're very mindful that we have to keep collecting that data and holding our officials at VA and elsewhere accountable. And that's what we intend to do.
Great. And my last question for you, during your presentation, you mentioned a number of different bills that were passed on a bipartisan basis. What do you see as the opportunities for bipartisanship between Democrats and the Biden administration and the Republicans in Congress going forward to advance the needs of veterans and end veterans' homelessness finally?
Well, I'll tell you what, Dennis, hopefully by the time people are watching this, we'll have passed the bipartisan infrastructure framework, sent it to the president, and he will have signed it. And that will be a great bipartisan win for the country, not just for our veterans, obviously, but it'll put a whole lot of veterans to work in those construction jobs for roads and bridges and water and broadband. But let me also say that I think it's really important we get everything we can get done on a bipartisan basis whenever we can, but that we also acknowledge that there will be times where we can't get everything done on a bipartisan basis, and we have to move with our majorities, narrow though they are, to advance policies that benefit veterans. my hope would be that most of those policies will be bipartisan in nature, just as the Isaacson Rowe bill and some of the other pandemic-related bills that I mentioned. My Economic Opportunity Subcommittee held a hearing in the fall on Senator Tester's comprehensive legislation to permanently expand pandemic relief resources for unhoused veterans and their families. And I expect that bill will receive strong bipartisan support as we move forward. The Building Solutions for Veterans Experiencing Homelessness Act of 2021 would permanently cut red tape on grants provided by VA for organizations assisting veterans experiencing homelessness. The bill would also ensure that organizations have the necessary funding to continue supporting veterans and to avoid derailing their pre-pandemic progress towards effectively ending veteran homelessness. And it would expand veterans' access to critical resources, including increased access to transportation, case management, job training, and improved transitional housing for aging veterans. And as I said, I expect that legislation and similar bills like it will receive bipartisan support. And my great hope is that we're going to move a lot more through the duration of the 117th Congress and do so in a bipartisan manner. And that's how our committee historically has functioned. And despite what you may read or hear about Congress as an institution, the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I think, remains a place where we all can go and work together in shared responsibility for those who have served our country.
Well, that's great news. Thank you very much, Congressman. On behalf, as son and grandson of veterans, World War I and World War II.
Wow.
I want to thank you very much for your service and for your work in the committee on behalf of the men and women of our armed forces. So thank you very much for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. As a grandson of a World War II veteran, it is truly an honor to get to serve on the House Veterans Affairs Committee. My grandpa's no longer with us, but he's always looking over my shoulder, making sure I get it right for veterans. So it's an honor to get to be with you and to get to do this work.
Thank you very much. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Hunter Kurtz, a former Assistant Secretary at HUD for Public and Indian Housing and a member of BPC's Housing Council. He's going to introduce and moderate our panel of experts. Thank you, Hunter. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for allowing me to be here to moderate this incredibly important panel on a very important subject, which is veterans homeless. And thank you, Congressman Levin, for joining us today. First, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists here. I'm going to start off with Roseanne Haggerty. She's the president and CEO of Community Solutions, an organization that works to end homelessness and strengthen communities. Next, we have Phil Mangano, who's the president and CEO of the American Roundtable to Abolish Homelessness, an organization that works with researchers and practitioners in local communities to identify effective strategies to tackle homelessness. We also have Catherine Monet. She's the CEO of the National Council for Homeless Veterans, a resource and technical assistance center for organizations providing assistance to homeless veterans. And finally, John Kuhn, who is the National Director for Supportive Services for Veterans Families at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Thank you all for joining us today. And if you all out there in the audience have questions, please either type those questions into the YouTube chat feature or tweet them with the hashtag BPCLive. And we will get to those questions in a few minutes. But as we wait for some of those to come in, I want to dive into a couple questions. Catherine, I'm going to start with you. We heard the Congressman discuss the 40,000 veterans that are still experiencing homelessness every night. We know that number has pre-pandemic, we've seen that number go down, but there's still a lot of work to do. What do you think are the root causes that lead to veterans to experience homelessness? And what are some of the common threads and shared experiences that these veterans have that experience homelessness?
Well, that's actually a really great question. And I think I've got a couple of things to say on the first part of that question. And the first thing I want to say is that veteran homelessness is not necessarily a monolith. There are lots of paths that lead people into homelessness. And I often think about it in kind of two buckets, right? So you think about the systemic factors that can contribute to homelessness, whether it's a shortage of affordable housing, whether it's a stagnant minimum wage and veterans that may be under or unemployed, or even some of the challenges that systemic and institutional racism might pose to a veteran who's out in the world. But then you think about some individual factors as well that might make it more challenging to sustain housing. So things like accessing mental health services, accessing supportive services, and that kind of plethora of resources that you can wrap around a veteran. And so I think that there are, a couple of factors. When you think about some of the common threads and shared experiences that we hear a lot about from veterans, there is kind of this feeling of being disconnected. I do think that some veterans are in situations where they're trying to navigate a system that wasn't necessarily built for them. So particularly when you think about subpopulations of veterans, aging veterans, women veterans, or parenting veterans, or folks where, the system has kind of been built for a certain type of veteran. I think some of those groups have more challenges in accessing services and resources, but they are able to access some of the really great newer programs that VA has put forth, like John's SSVF program and, the HUD-VASH program as well.
Sort of a question for the panel in general. I think the pandemic both sort of highlighted and exacerbated some of the homelessness across the nation. It definitely has impacted these unsheltered individuals and put them at greater health risk. How do you think that COVID has specifically impacted homeless veterans that may not have impacted other veterans? I'm sorry, other homeless individuals, not other veterans.
But I think that there have certainly been negative impacts of it on the entire homeless population and veterans as well. But even as the congressman indicated, that there have been some positive responses that have been made. So for example, he mentioned that 20,000 or more veterans have been placed in hotel and motel units during the pandemic, keep them safe or to isolate them. And that, in fact, out of that experience, tens of thousands of homeless veterans have been housed. So sometimes in the midst of a difficulty, you can pull out an opportunity. And I certainly think that during COVID, the additional monies that were made available around our country that were targeted to a broad population, many of them found their way into the lives of homeless people and homeless veterans. So I think in that sense, COVID provided an opportunity to do some things that were not done before that have actually had some pretty positive results.
So I'm sorry, did I interrupt someone?
I'm just going to expand on some of what Phil and Representative Levin were sharing. There indeed have been important lessons from COVID. And actually our up-to-date numbers now, we've got 32,000 folks who are placed in hotels, 20,000 who have now been placed into permanent housing from those hotels, about 3,000 in now. It's couplefold. First, we have to be able to be extremely adaptable. COVID, more than any other incident, I think in recent memory, has shown how quickly the environment can change. And our programs cannot be static. We have to be able to adapt to meet the needs of the people we serve. If we are anything less, it means people die. This is no different than anyone walking to an emergency room. Their needs for care are critical, urgent, and must be met immediately. We can't wait for 6 months of policy review and vetting, and the response has to be immediate sometimes. And that's, in fact, we were fortunate enough to be able to do. VA really came out in front and supported. And in March 2020, we were doing hotel and motel placements. And when I say we, I don't mean me. I mean grantees around the country who I have to tip my hat to. These are nonprofits who were faced with the very same barriers and challenges that everyone else, every other American faced, yet they were able to somehow completely transform their organizations, which were permanent housing organizations, into organizations that could make relationships with hotel and motel operators around the country, convince them that they should take in this homeless population and serve them. and did an incredible job of doing it, providing life-saving services for these 32,000 people and more who continue to be placed. A couple of things we also learned is that there are people who came into the hotels and motels who were never interested in homeless services before, and they were frequently tagged with this unfortunate moniker that they were treatment resistant, right? We've all heard that, treatment resistant. But the reality is that they refused to accept conditions that many of us would not accept. They did not want to live in a shelter where they were fearful. They did not want to be forced to jump through all sorts of hoops and rules that were often required for them in more traditional programs. But when offered dignity and a safe place to stay, like a hotel or motel, they came in. And we found people who were in encampments, who were chronically homeless, who for many years refused any kinds of services, came into our hotels and motels and were served and ultimately placed in permanent housing. That was an important lesson for us. So we are going to keep that resource available for folks who aren't really appropriate for these more traditional programs. With that comes additional responsibilities. We know these folks are also more prone to health consequences, underlying health issues. They need to be linked to services, both health and mental health care services, in a much more direct and assertive way. We've developed a program of healthcare navigators now. We have 340, or our grantees around the country, there are 342 healthcare navigators, providing a linkage to those services that these veterans need. And that means in not just VA, because VA, of course, serves honorably discharged veterans, but also the community for the other than honorably discharged veterans that are about 15% of our client population. They're linked to these critically needed services. So these are important lessons we've learned, and now we're going to be pivoting again. That as COVID recedes, and now we're facing a rent affordability crisis, much worse than we had prior. I mean, this was always an issue for us. So I think everyone on this call knows affordability has always been an issue. It is much more severe now, and we begin to pivot towards that and have already begun developing programs. In fact, we have a interim final rule that will be published tomorrow that will increase our shallow subsidy rate to 50% of rent reasonableness, giving us a new powerful tool to provide permanent housing to our homeless veteran households.
That's great. I want to sort of continue with that theme, though, and John, you sort of answered the question, but I want to ask the other panelists. So, what was the, what's sort of the best lesson we've learned from COVID as dealing with veterans homelessness? Roseanne, do you want to?
Sure. Let me jump in, and thank you, Hunter, and all for the opportunity to be here. As others have said, I think COVID and the clear state of emergency enabled both government and not-for-profits to come together in the face of a clear emergency to just really tackle some of the implementation challenges that have frustrated the kind of progress that we know is possible on this issue, and to really elevate John's observation. Just faced with the clear emergency, given specific resources and the flexibility to use them to get individuals into safe accommodation and then from there housed. I think all over the country you had communities experience that indeed this is a solvable problem, and the kind of atmosphere of collaboration, streamlining implementation of programs and resources, finding a way to get things done in the face of a life challenging threat is something that we can be carrying forward, in fact, are carrying forward. And the context that my organization, Community Solutions, encounters this issue is through our Built for Zero initiative. We're working now with 98 continuum of care entities around the country. And in the spirit of this bipartisan discussion, they're very, every type of political environment. And as others earlier in the call have mentioned, this is such a bipartisan issue. Just getting to the end of veteran homelessness. There's such momentum now, the flexibility John described in new programs. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is, and it goes to the particular work we do, is the more you can support collaboration, clear, real-time information on who is experiencing the problem of veteran homelessness, having that population level view across the community, and the granular information on which individuals need to be assisted is part and parcel of being effective, dynamic, getting the job done. And I think that was very much a lesson in communities that made progress in reducing veteran homelessness during the pandemic. Communities that were already organized, collaborating, knew who the veterans were who were experiencing homelessness, were able to take advantage of these new resources and the atmosphere of sort of accelerated problem solving to show what's possible.
What do you think was the best lesson from COVID?
I think the urgency of innovation is probably the best lesson. And I think that extends not only to John's SSVF program, but also to the ways in which VA programs collaborated with each other, where some of them were paying apartment holding fees and supporting veterans in different places to keep folks safe. But I do also think I want to highlight that, there are a lot of veterans that would prefer to be in hotels, but then we've also heard from some that really want treatment. And one of the really great things that came out of the pandemic was really trying to re-envision what transitional housing could look like and the kind of format and function of a transitional housing facility and how it could be decongregated such that we could continue to provide those services to veterans who chose to have that as a part of their path out of homelessness.
And Phil?
I think one of the things that certainly came out of COVID, and it relates to the response that was literally made all over the country, not just for veterans, but for the entire homeless population, that reconfirmed that housing together with services, that's what works. And of course, that's exactly what the HUD-VASH program is all about, where HUD provides a housing voucher, VA provides the support services. That's the best program that ever came out of the federal government, probably one of the best programs on homelessness ever devised, way back by Jack Kemp and the original VA Secretary, Ed Derwinski, way back in the late 1980s. That posited that housing together with services would work for homeless veterans. And now we're here 30 years later. And again, what COVID offered us an opportunity to do is to see that the targeted resources that created the housing and services, they do work. They move people out of transitional settings, off the street, out of encampments, and into permanent housing. So I think the reaffirmation of what many of us have called for in terms of targeted resources, specifically focused on the lives of homeless people. That's what HUD-VASH was. That's what a lot of the initiatives in COVID were oriented to. They just work. Housing with services gets people out and literally ends their homelessness.
John, I'm going to come back to you. And, between, maybe the 10, 15 years leading up to the COVID crisis, we've seen a remarkable decrease in the number of homeless veterans. Some people's, the estimate is about 50%. So who or what do you think is to credit for that reduction, and what has been the role of programs like HUD-VASH or the SSVF or other programs that the federal government has in meeting that reduction?
I think, Hunter, in some ways, the answer is quite simple. The federal government was willing to make an investment in permanent housing, and that came across in HUD-VASH and SSVF. With that investment, we got a remarkable decrease in homelessness among veterans. So it was a pretty straight causative line. Now, what has also happened is in the last 4 years, we have not seen as a dramatic decline. We had very steep declines early on. The plateaus flattened. Now, compared to the overall homeless population, that looks pretty good, but it's still not where we want to be. And I want to come back to a theme that Roseanne raised about collaboration. I think one of the things we've seen, and Catherine raised this as well, is where we have seen collaboration, we have seen success. So for instance, the public housing authorities slowed down for a while during COVID. But because of collaboration between different VA programs, we were able, our SSVF grantees were able to help place 11,000 of those homeless veterans into public housing or through HUD-VASH while those PHAs got back up and running. We didn't wait for people in homelessness. We worked together, we collaborated. This collaboration now has to extend even deeper and further into the community We know now with the number of housing vouchers we have, with the additional money we've gotten through the American Rescue Plan, there is enough permanent housing placements available to end homelessness nationwide. But this will take a concerted effort at a community level to make sure these resources are allocated in a way that makes sense. We need to ensure that communities are planful, not just with the number they have homeless now, and most every community have by name lists, but also to be thinking about and planning what's going to happen over the next year. How many people are going to inflow into that community's homeless system? How do we, first of all, if we can, prevent it using diversion methods? And there are terrific new techniques about how to divert folks from homelessness. We call it in SSEF rapid resolution, but there's problem solving that's going on around the country. There are great techniques to try to stem that inflow. So we need to do that. But we also, as people come into these services, need to figure out who needs that HUD-VASH voucher, who needs a shallow subsidy, who needs rapid rehousing, and to make that work. And if we can make that work, we end homelessness, certainly among veterans, and that can happen soon.
Great. I'd sort of open that question up to the rest of the panel. What do you credit for the reduction pre-pandemic in veterans homelessness?
Well, there's no question that John's initial comment that there was a direct correlation between the HUD-VASH program, which issued for a number of years from the time that Jack Kemp oriented it through administrations, whether they had a D or an R after their name. 10,000 vouchers were made available consistently, and that certainly had an important effect in terms of driving the numbers down. Most of the numbers we look at right now are just 2010 to 2019, but in fact, prior to that, in previous administrations, the numbers of homeless veterans were also reduced quite substantially. When I first went to Washington to lead the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, the number of homeless veterans given to us by VA was 130,000 veterans. So there was a substantial reduction all through the time that HUD-VASH was made available. John also signaled that in the last 4 years, the numbers didn't decline so much. Well, if we look at the data, what it tells us is that the number of HUD-VASH vouchers that were made available actually declined during those 4 years. Went down to 6,000, I think 4,000 1 year. So there is that direct correlative. I would be cautious, though. I would be very cautious about saying that we have sufficient resources in the system right now to get the job done. That would undermine additional HUD-VASH vouchers being made available. There's a new allotment of them that is about to come out soon. And I think that when you have something that correlates so dramatically with reductions, I think you want to make sure you preserve those, given that even the secretary in a speech today, Secretary of VA today, was talking about the 40,000 veterans who are currently homeless in our country. I think we want to be cautious about saying we have sufficient resources. We certainly have sufficient resources to drive the numbers down, but several more allocations of HUD-VASH minimally will be necessary to get the entire job done.
Pick up on one of Catherine's observations in that spirit about the need for innovation, and of which we saw so much during COVID. There are, I think, as veteran homelessness decreases in communities, there are opportunities to right-size existing programs. To John's point, how can we make very effective use of all of the resources being devoted to ending veteran homelessness? And for example, the grant per diem program, we've seen some very significant innovation physically, taking buildings that were designed to be more congregate, grants through the VA to allow those properties to become individual units. It's really a half step to making those buildings permanent housing, to actually, as veteran homelessness recedes, how might the VA continue this path of innovation to even look at existing programs and how they could evolve to move resources into more support for permanent housing, where the needs for transitional housing may be waning, and put more resources into creative prevention and diversion programs, as John was saying. So I think looking at the whole resource mix and what can be how greater flexibility can help meet the needs of every veteran who's experiencing homelessness and prevent new veterans from experiencing homelessness maybe ought to be one of the lenses we use, not simply a single program and its undoubted effectiveness.
Is there, and I'll ask sort of everyone this question, but specifically John, is there something more that can be done before, an active duty military person becomes a veteran to help sort of stem the possibility that they become homeless?
Sure. So first, I want to thank Phil pointing out the resource issue. I mean, it is, while we have sufficient resources today, many of those resources are going to be short-lived. They're dependent on the American Rescue Plan and CARES. They go away. And if they are not sustained, we're going to be back in the same boat in just a couple of years. So I want to thank Phil for pointing out that resources are still going to be an issue going forward, even if they're looking pretty good right now. As for veterans seeking services who are coming out of the military, I have a son who's a Marine who's in the Middle East right now. And I can tell you he's probably going to come out in the spring and be done, and he's going to go through the TAP. And like every other Marine, he's not going to pay much attention. He's just thinking about how he can get out as quickly as possible. Please don't make me sit through another boring presentation. So the best plans for people discharging from the military are very hard for these young men and women to absorb. We need to be prepared that in the community, when they land back into civilian life, that we're able to reach out for them, when they may be starting to need or think about these services. So that's going to be required an ongoing community-based effort that's going to never end. We are always going to have to be engaged in outreach and education. Even if we end homelessness, there's always going to be people at risk that be flowing into these services. So we need to have partners throughout the community to make sure that that doesn't happen, or if it does happen, as we all know, brief and as short as possible, please. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to add to that, or?
So yeah, I'd like to actually pick up on that, because I do think that community partners are important, but one of the really great preventive factors, right, is access to VA care and understanding the constellation of benefits that's actually available to a veteran. And, one of the really great things about VA is that there is a short eligibility window after a veteran transitions, after a service member transitions into veteran status, but not every veteran takes advantage of that 5-year window. And so one of the really great things that, Congress or anyone really could think about doing is pushing for auto enrollment into VA care, such that anyone who was eligible just automatically got it, started to engage with VA healthcare and services, and actually started to understand the whole breadth of what is out there to take advantage of and to utilize.
Phil, Roseanne?
Well, certainly second Catherine's point, I think what we know about behavioral economics is that if you make the default setting, that you're actually connected to a resource, as opposed to having to find a resource when you're a moment of crisis, I think that could totally solve the problem that John has identified as really needing to educate veterans before they need the services, that those services exist. So just a +1 on Catherine's terrific point.
And I believe actually the VA has a program whereby people who are discharged by DOD, there's a consulting group that actually interviews people after they're discharged with regard to a variety of different resources that are available. I think the expansion of that program to look at the residential capacity of the person when they're discharged, do they have a place to go? I think that would be an important expansion of the effort that's being made, because there is an acknowledgement that when a person leaves service, years ago, they were simply discharged and they had some papers in one hand, a duffel bag in the other hand, and off they went out into the community. Times have changed, and the at-riskness of homelessness is now so pronounced that revving up that kind of interviewing, aggressive interviewing at the point of discharge is critical. It's critical from a variety of different systems, from mental health systems, from substance abuse systems, from foster care. Certainly that should be implemented in terms of people coming out of the military, given how many veterans do fall into homelessness.
So I'm going to take a moment and just encourage our audience members to submit some questions through the YouTube chat or by tweeting hashtag BPC Live. Our next question is for everyone on the panel, but with new leadership in every administration in recent times, actually going back to Lincoln, there's been a commitment to veterans and a commitment to combating veteran homelessness, and even sort of hot off the presses, we know that the VA Secretary just a few minutes before we began this conversation made that very commitment at the National Press Club today. What are what do you think are the key challenges that the Biden administration is facing right now to help deal with veterans homelessness? Catherine, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably can think of a few. I want to start with housing affordability, just because that's the elephant in the room and something that the great programs at VA don't really have any control over, unfortunately, right? So housing affordability is, I think, the number one thing. My number two thing would probably be HUD-VASH, making sure that the program is working really well, that case management is staffed up or ramped up sufficiently. And I think number three would be continuing to lead and innovate and make sure that the programs that are there are really meeting the needs of veterans today, right now.
Go ahead, Phil.
Sorry, I would just jump in and say the obstacles that this administration faces are very similar to the ones previous administrations have faced. As I go around the country, the single greatest impediment in terms of moving forward with the objective of ending veterans homelessness is insufficient units that are available to veterans, or insufficient units for which a HUD-VASH will get them into housing. So that obstacle of actually utilizing the resource that's available, because there are insufficient units available, that's the most substantial obstacle in terms of moving forward on the objective of ending people's homelessness. I would say there's an opportunity for the Biden administration right now in California, the largest state in our country, where the governor has, through a program called Home Key, that really came out of utilizing hotel and motel units initially in terms of a COVID response. That program is now transformed into what's called Home Key. The governor has just invested several billion dollars, several billion dollars a year for the next several years to create housing out of both hotel motel conversions and the conversions of apartment buildings or wherever we can find units. It's an attempt to respond to the lack of units that are available and the lack of ability to lease up HUD-VASH vouchers. What we know around the country is that there are about 20 to 22,000 HUD-VASH vouchers that lie dormant. In California alone, there are over 5,000 vouchers. In Los Angeles itself, there are 2,500 that are dormant, that are unutilized. So it's the creation of the units. And what the governor proposed in terms of Home Key was to create as many units as possible, as quickly as possible, targeted to homeless people. There's been an effort on the part of California to engage the VA to join together Home Key, which provides acquisition and rehab dollars, with HUD-VASH, which provides rent and services. It's like a match made in heaven, because those are the things that you need. And that is stalled right now. And that would be an enormous moving forward on the issue of veterans homeless, because so many of the homeless veterans in our country are located in California. So the hope is that there will be a response from the Biden administration. And I know staffing up in the federal government, in my own 7 years working in the federal government, staffing up with new administrations is one of the most difficult things to do. And undoubtedly, this has a bit to do with staffing up. But the utilization of resources that currently exist into units, HUD-VASH into units, there's a real opportunity in California to demonstrate a model on how that can be done and to reduce the number of homeless veterans significantly. That's a real opportunity for the Biden administration.
to expand on that a little bit because we have seen, you know, there. You're right. There is sort of a vast across the country difference between some communities and how they perform with HUD-VASH versus others. You know, you look at places like San Diego or New York City who've done exceedingly well with their utilization of HUD-VASH vouchers, and then other communities, I won't name any of those, that have not. And you know, some of these communities that have succeeded, again, San Diego, New York, are high-cost areas. What are they doing, or what strategies are they using that it might be possible to replicate in other parts of the country?
Well, maybe I'll jump in, start it off, and then others can certainly. I know John will undoubtedly have some thoughts on this. I think in some places in the country, the further involvement of the private sector has been an incredibly important element in moving people and utilizing the HUD-VASH resource. And that includes, with the HUD-VASH resource, HUD provides the voucher, VA has the money to provide the services. There are parts of our country wherein rather than the VA itself providing the services, they've farmed those out, they've outsourced those to community groups, and the community groups have in fact provided the services. And one of the things that we've discovered in that is that the level of social capital that goes into the life of a veteran who goes into a community group, rather than simply having services provided by the VA, that level of social capital goes up dramatically. And if there's one thing we know about homelessness, is that every homeless person has a deficiency of social capital. Any of us familiar with Bowling Alone, the great book by Robert Putnam, knows that our country as a whole has a diminished set of social capital. So the idea of utilizing community groups that already exist and who already have connections into the community will lift a veteran into employment, will lift a veteran into other connections in the community more rapidly than the provision of services by people who are hired as case managers by the VA. So that's one of the correlative factors, I think, that's creating greater success in some places. Undoubtedly, John, you have some other thoughts on that.
Well, I think there's a number of steps we can take and have taken. I have to tip my hat to the VA and being leaders here, that they have put in $350 million to our child subsidy initiative, which provides 50% of rent reasonableness, not of the FMR, which means a sizable rental subsidy that does not change. So unlike most rental subsidies, a veteran's family's income can increase and the subsidy will remain the same, providing a powerful incentive to increase your income, whether that's by employment or benefits. And the Department of Labor has partnered with VA through their Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program to try to boost income. So that's an important part of this. Try to help these veteran families become as much as possible sustaining and self-sufficient, where they're not constantly on the verge of homelessness, because we know that the housing burden, the costs of housing are so great, the housing burden is so great that even when we get people housed, they're hanging on by their fingernails. And we need to get away from this cycle of people constantly being at imminent risk of homelessness. We also need to take a look at other kinds of resources that will prevent people from entering homelessness. The Veterans Justice Outreach Program is a powerful tool to try to identify folks who we know are at higher risk and try to divert them from entering homelessness using research. So for instance, HUD and VA worked to develop a screening tool that's research informed. We had leading researchers, I'm going to name drop Mary Beth Shin, Jill Kadari, who have helped us develop this to try to identify those who are most at risk and prevent them from coming into homelessness. Because let's not only avoid the homelessness and the cost, but the trauma of that experience and the trauma to the children and the family members of that experience is hard to remove easily simply by rehousing. So there are a number of steps we are taking. The resources need to be diversified in that way to as we have a better understanding, use the data to drive these services. But I'm going to come back to that local community planning has to happen. There is no substitute for people on the ground, those local stakeholders, to figure out what's going on in their community, identify who's homeless, identify who's at risk and who's coming in, and plan for that.
I'll pick up on points that both Phil and John made, Hunter. We see that across the country, communities that are well organized and focus on coordination, as well as having very comprehensive real-time data, are in a position, even in very straitened housing markets, to make progress. They're better able to harness resources across the community, as others have said. The more you can sort of tap resources from many places, the more options you have. And in fact, there are many parts of the country where the housing markets are not as unforgiving as in California, where there's still underutilized VASH vouchers. This is a problem of coordination and implementation. So we see just enormous opportunities that the Biden and Harris administration could promote, with just incenting every dollar that goes out to communities for, and that can specifically, or that could be used to assist the project of ending veteran homelessness, make reducing homelessness at a population level, the focus of that money, not just time with respect to a dynamic shifting problem like homelessness. Many communities don't have a current feed on what's happening with respect to the number of veterans experiencing homelessness at this moment. They may, at a point in time, but it's important that every community be equipped to have that real-time view of the problem. And then I'd say another opportunity that can be incented by federal action would be around providing additional capacity. And the VA has been a leader in this, as John has described, in terms of things like the Navigator program that is now funded. But we see, particularly in rural areas, that it is just really hard for communities to have the outreach capability, or to have someone in the role of managing data and managing coordination, seeing that all of the activities across a community aimed at assisting veterans are actually adding up to a clear and accountable process for reducing and ending veteran homelessness. So investing in that local system management capability and outreach capability could make a huge difference.
And I do think further that reaching out to the private sector, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, to resolve some of the local issues that VA medical centers face in terms of placing homeless people in housing. So upgrading the housing search, sometimes called housing navigation, their housing search, upgrading that, and privatizing it, outsourcing it if necessary. They can't get the job done. And certainly on the case management side, I know Catherine alluded to this earlier, a number of VAs around the country have a difficulty in bringing their case management capacity up to meet what the problem, the size, the quantity of the problem is. So rather than leaving those veterans without the case management services, again, outsourcing VA resources to bring in community groups to provide that case management. Otherwise, you've got a large funnel of homeless people with lots of homeless veterans all throughout it. But without the appropriate search and stabilization, people simply drip out of the bottom of that funnel. And what that causes, for example, in Los Angeles, we've got housing authorities who have scores of units that were targeted to homeless veterans that lie unoccupied because the number of referrals coming from the VA were insufficient to meet the number of units. What that does is it backs up the whole system and puts at risk HUD, VASH, and other veterans' resources because it looks like the system isn't working appropriately. So I think there is an opportunity. The Biden administration inherited that. So I think there's an opportunity to unglue that system by being much more responsive to the possibilities of bringing the private side, whether again, for-profit or nonprofit, and to help them with some of the difficulties they face on a local level.
Catherine, do you?
Yeah, I actually want to echo what Phil said about finding landlords and bringing the private sector into that mix a little bit more. I think we've seen communities find really great success when they've got really great, landlord outreach, navigation, and those types of tools. But I think that there are some other innovative things out there that maybe system-wide we haven't necessarily touched, right? I mean, we're seeing in some communities that they've got landlord mitigation funds or different ways to really offer landlords better incentives and more reassurance that taking a risk on a veteran exiting homelessness is not going to be as risky as they think it is. And there are some communities that are actually using a decent number of their vouchers to push veterans towards home ownership, which I think is something that we haven't necessarily unpacked. And in certain type markets, that may or may not be an appropriate answer. And so I do think that there are, innovative ways that this administration could really look at getting more vouchers kind of out the door and in the hands of veterans effectively.
Yeah, I will add on to that myself, actually. And I think you mentioned something that's really, really key is and it's not just for HUD VASH, but just for all of the voucher programs at HUD. We were doing a lot of work that unfortunately COVID sort of put on the back burner while I was there, related to engaging landlords and determining how they can participate. And you bring up a really good example of some of the mitigation funds and just other ways that HUD can make it easier for landlords to participate in HUD VASH and the other housing choice voucher programs. And I think that's essential to the success of all of these programs.
And I think to add on to that, Hunter, the idea of professionalizing housing search, get all the housing search workers in a community under one roof so that there's peer support and so that they're not artificially increasing rents when a landlord hears from 5 different programs in their city, they all want that unit. So the landlord would, of course, naturally think my unit must be worth more than I think it is because there's an artificial demand on it. So professionalizing housing search, putting it all under one roof. We've seen that work in a number of places in the country. We started it in Boston years and years ago. It's in Los Angeles right now. That would be an important next step for HUD in terms of its general programs, but it would be very beneficial to homeless veterans as well.
We need to lower the barriers for our landlords as well. We're asking our landlords to take risks and be customers and partners with us. So we need to invest in legal services so we can help clear up some issues for our prospective tenants. It doesn't help when a tenant or a prospective tenant is looking at getting income seized, like if they open up a bank account and it's garnished or wages garnished. None of these things they're going to all jump out in a background report, and it's going to dissuade a landlord who even wants to work with our clients, our veterans, to doing it. So we need to invest in legal resources to clear these issues up. We are actually doing that. We're investing $24 million in new funding to make sure that every veteran who comes through SSVF gets at least an assessment to understand what those issues are. Another important thing to understand about legal services is for our veterans and others who have had encounters with the criminal justice system, they've often been quite unpleasant. We know quite well now just from racial equity issues that very often it's to avoid all legal contact at all costs. Now that doesn't necessarily help if you have an outstanding issue that needs to be cleared up. So we need to provide some reassurance and incentive to veterans to volunteer issues so our grantees can work on them and help resolve them. That's going to take some education and that's going to take time and an investment.
If I could just jump in for one more second on this, Hunter. I think our normal disposition toward housing search and the like is that we go out and we beg landlords to take our clients and we figure out different kinds of innovative incentives. All of that's very good. But in California, as a result of Home Key, what we're seeing is the units that they're creating in hotel motel conversions, only homeless people can live in those units. So it's not a question of begging any longer. These are units created specifically for the well-being of homeless people, and only homeless people can live in it. That completely reverses the whole intentionality around getting landlords to work with us, because the very communities and private sector entities that are creating the units, those units are only available for homeless people. So that really changes the equation and allows more units. So there will literally be thousands of units created tens of thousands of units created in California, where that would be the way that things will function. That makes a tremendous change. It will help decrease homelessness among veterans significantly, especially if the Biden administration partners with the governor of the state of California.
Maybe,
So,
Hunter, I will add one thing to Philip's
Sure.
comments because it hasn't come up. The VA is a very significant property owner across the country, and in many places, especially in the Midwest and the Northeast, there's properties that are underutilized. And so, as we're thinking about the housing production needs that could meet the ongoing needs for veterans and their housing supports, as well as others in the community, that property should be in play.
That's a very good point. And we are sort of a little, I think, pushing our time here, but I want to sneak a couple more questions in, and I want to ask the audience to please consider submitting something either on the YouTube chat or by tweeting at BPC Live. Love to get some questions from you all. Roseanne, what bipartisan opportunities do you see both Congress and the Biden administration have to advance the goal of ending veterans homelessness?
Well, Hunter, as it's been the theme throughout the conversation here, this is a bipartisan issue. In administration after administration, there's been enormous commitment and continuity to do right by veterans and end this completely solvable problem of veteran homelessness. And so I think immediately in front of us, we've had a lot of thoughtful comments, but I think I'm very much locked on to what we're learning from the communities in which we work, which is the importance of having all federal resources be very intentional about the desired end state, which is how is this program, how are these resources in any community contributing to an end to veteran homelessness, which is actually a different proposition than sustaining good programs. Both have to happen. And how is everything we're doing adding up measurably to getting closer to this vital goal? And it also requires, I think, a new embrace of data and accountability for collaboration. This is not an issue the VA can solve alone. The VA, I think, to some of the earlier part of the conversation, has been a leader in reaching out to other agencies and communities, to other partners, saying how can we put it all together differently? And federal funding that incents that kind of collaboration, having by name real-time data and making that the standard that communities are asked to meet, so that everyone who is experiencing homelessness as a veteran and others are known in real time, and that it's also a mechanism for seeing what's working. And then lastly, helping communities actually function as collaborative bodies. That's always the job that everyone agrees it's collaboration is vital. It's never funded, but that could be something that this administration really invests in, that local capacity to collaborate, to problem solve in real time, and to not leave any veteran behind.
Catherine, John, or Phil?
I would say in response to your question, Hunter, when I was in Washington heading up the Interagency Council, I worked with consecutive secretaries, Secretary Principi, Secretary Nicholson, and Secretary Peake. And since then, I've known several of the secretaries, Bob McDonald and Secretary Shinseki. In all the conversations I ever had with any of them, partisanship and doing something for political reasons never, ever came up. It was always considered to be a nonpartisan perspective. So I think we're grateful to you and to the Bipartisan Policy Center, and also, of course, to the Terwilliger Policy Center on Housing, to actually convene this group, which I think, again, in its bipartisan format, reaffirms that this issue there's no D or R after veterans homelessness. There is simply a group of us Americans attempting to tackle and complete the mission for veterans. We certainly can say at this point, we know what to do and we know how to do it. There are 80,000 veterans who have been housed through the HUD-NASH program. There are another 30 or so thousand, 35 to 40,000 yet to go, but we have a pretty good bead on how to get their homelessness resolved. And I think that's the kind of message which does have bipartisan traction. We have the solutions at hand, and what we need is the consistent support of the Congress and administrations. And I would say there's no question that the current administration has indicated that level of political will, not only from Secretary McDonough, who you rightly said spoke this very day on this issue, but Secretary Fudge on several occasions has made the exact same vision available for HUD. And of course, in a joint communique that they did a couple of months ago, they committed both of their agencies to solving the dilemma of veterans homelessness. So I think there is a certain momentum to the bipartisanship on this issue that is forwarded by even the people on this call. I think we all understand this gets done, but it only gets done in complete partnership, again, with no D or R.
Catherine or John?
If I could add that, I agree certainly with everything that has been just said by Roseanne and Phil about partnership and the funding. We need also to make sure that the staff out there who are actually carrying out these responsibilities get the support they need. Very often these staff are not well paid, under tremendous stress, particularly during COVID. We need to make sure that the training resources they need, so they know what those best practices are, so they know how to be effective, will certainly help keep them in their roles because they'll feel more productive and have more job satisfaction. But more importantly for us, the job will get done because they're going to be using techniques that are proven and are going to be more effective and will support the coordination and collaboration we've all talked about.
Catherine?
Yeah, so I do want to flag, because this didn't come up at all today, right? That there are some really significant resources for affordable housing in VA's Enhanced Use Lease program and the Build Back Better Act, right? I'm talking, when I say significant, I mean truly game changing, right? $25 billion in rental assistance, $15 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, and $455 million for the Enhanced Use Lease program. And so I do think that one really great thing that Congress could do in a bipartisan fashion would be to actually push this bill forward and pass it. But I do also think that having the support of the administration for these provisions remaining in the bill is going to be crucial, right? I mean, there have been so many negotiations over the size of this package, over what programs stayed and what programs didn't stay. And so I think the administration should definitely continue to stay the course and ensure that these housing investments and the VA investments are still contained in whatever final package moves forward.
So we did get a question from the audience. Carly Henriquez asks, are transgender veterans facing more homelessness even with programs put in place? Does anyone, or I'll pick.
Well, so I can
Go ahead,
a
Catherine.
little bit, and maybe John can pick up, right? And I do think that, VA's National Center on Homelessness Among Veterans has done some really great research on this, and transgender veterans tend to be, although a small population, one of the growing populations of veterans experiencing homelessness. And so I do think that we need to pay closer attention to the ways in which we serve them and the ways in which we make programs really meet their needs.
Systemic inequality is certainly an enormous issue we have all witnessed, both for the LGBT community, for persons of color. We need to make sure that our systems of care are responsive to their needs, but also understand in our prevention efforts that these folks are disproportionately represented among the ranks of the homeless. And we need to do more to prevent them from entering homelessness and understand in our prevention efforts how to target these groups more effectively.
So final question, lightning round. And it is, if the question is, and I'm going to put some parameters after I ask you the question. If I gave you a magic wand and you could fix one thing with veterans homelessness, what would it be? And you can't answer end veterans homelessness. What one thing would you do that would change to improve the likelihood to end veterans homelessness? That may be a better way to phrase the question. So I'll start off with Catherine.
Healthy housing market?
Phil?
Increase the capacity to utilize fully all of the HUD-VASH vouchers that are out there in the country that number over 20,000, and do that by creating units that are targeted specifically to veterans. That is not affordable housing, but housing affordable to homeless people, specifically in this case, homeless veterans.
And Roseanne?
Right-size the GPD program in the spirit of using every VA homelessness resource in an optimal way to end veteran homelessness.
Well, I thank you all for participating in this panel today, and I want to thank everyone out there who's been listening in, especially those practitioners out there, especially during this time of COVID. I know it's not been easy, and we thank you for all of your hard work and dedication to this incredibly important subject matter. Thank you. Please keep an eye out for more work that's going to come from the Bipartisan Policy Center's Terwilliger Housing Center. And I look forward to continuing a conversation with you all in the future and continue our good work and trying to combat veterans homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter.
Thank you.
Thank you.